So thanks for coming out. Thank you to Blue Stockings for having us. We're going to talk about this book that we got over here, Anarchist Education in the Modern School, Francisco Ferrer reader. We come at this from two different angles. I'm a historian of radical political movements, Spanish history. Rob's a professor of education. So between us, we have the radical and the education and the radical education. We're going to talk a little about the modern school, a little bit about Francisco Ferrer, the revolutionary historical figure, what the modern school can say about education today, what it can't say about education today, and thinking what anarchist or radical pedagogy means. So to start out with, let's start sort of with the end of the story. On October 13th, 1909, Francisco Ferrer was executed by firing squad in the moat outside Montjuïc Castle overlooking Barcelona. He was accused of being the mastermind of the Tragic Week Rebellion, which was this really intense rebellion that we'll talk about later against conscription for a colonial war in Morocco. So he was accused of being the conspirator of this massive rebellion. His defenders say, no, he didn't mastermind any rebellion, he just started an elementary school. So there's a big difference between masterminding a rebellion and starting an elementary school. And so part of what we're going to try and figure out today is... The mic stand keeps sliding. Thank you. Nah, it's fine. Is exactly what's going on there. There are basically three kind of faces of Francisco Ferrer, as I talk about in the book. His detractors say that he was this bloodthirsty, satanic figure who taught little children how to make bombs and destroy tradition. Some of that maybe is true. The bomb part is actually not true. His sort of defenders would say, no, he just started this rationalist school that was all about science and rationality. He was against all dogma, against all sectarianism, and only wanted the truth. And then the sort of international anarchist movement that came to embrace him said that, no, he was the epitome of anarchist orthodoxy because he wanted to root out superstition and authoritarian error at the root by working with children. And so by the end of this evening, you'll see that none of these three depictions is fully correct. And he was actually a really complex figure who dabbled in all sorts of things and kind of weird, kind of awesome, very unusual and bizarre. So I'm going to hand it over to Rob for a little bit to take a step back and talk about the background of this project.
Can everyone hear me all right? No? You want the microphone? All right. Usually I do a microphone at the college and they go, it's too loud, it's too loud. So everyone can hear me now? All right. So I just want to kind of give a heads up like how we got into this project. I think it's kind of interesting. Probably for the last decade or so, I've been trying to piece together a lot of radical educational spaces that have been operating not only like historically but also in more contemporary times. And more recently, in about 2012, the Anarchist Pedagogy's book came out and that edited, and then recently Out of the Ruins book. And most of that has been really more contemporary work of what people have been doing internationally, but I say that within the context of mostly the U.S., Canada, and Europe. And so anyways, I've worked at PM Press for quite some time, and before that, I was friends with Ramsey for quite some time. He said, hey, why don't we work on the Ferrer book, re-release it. And it's sporadically been released out of all of, a lot of different places, but part of me was like, well, I think we need to put Ferrer in context. And what I think is, for me at least, a lot of students, especially when I use Ferrer and other people, is the lack of context, historical context, with who the person was. So if they read the origins, his book, you begin to start seeing, well, who's this guy? What is he doing? So we need some historical context. So I was actually watching a video online, and I can't remember the...
Anarchism in Madrid.
Yeah, Anarchism in Madrid, and there's a video, and there's a really interesting clip in there. One of the people in the video really talked about pedagogy, and meaning the teaching, the process of teaching. And so I was really interested in that, going, oh my gosh, like people are actually talking about this and really wanting to engage in this on a sort of movement level, right? And so I contacted Mark and I said, hey, I really like that video that you've done. And we started kind of contacting, going back and forth. And then I found out, oh, I do work in sort of Spanish anarchism and some of the history and stuff. I said, oh, this would be a perfect fit, to be able to kind of work through. So I contacted him, and to be honest, I was blown away, because I had this first idea that we're just going to do a few sections in the book of really putting it historically, and then having having his book, and then maybe some pieces at the end of kind of the impact he had on people during that time. And what I thought was really impressive and was Mark just took it to a whole nother level, and really he'll talk more about it, but is really bringing it, that his work and Ferrer's work to another level in terms of translating it, and then also looking at other people, the conversations that were going on during that time that I think are really important, that puts it not only in context, but I think puts in today's sort of contemporary times, we'll talk more about that later, just thinking about these issues at this time of, how do we teach people, right? What is the relationship that we develop over time with the teacher-student relationship, especially when we're trying to destroy hierarchical processes. So that becomes a problem, right? So I think that was a really important part of that, and really it's happened fairly quickly over the last couple of years, really putting this together, and so it finally came out. So we're really excited about it. But I just want to kind of give you a backdrop of what kind of brought us to that, and then also kind of moving into who he was and what context can we learn from him today. So,
okay, so who was he? Francisco Ferrer. Let's talk about his political background. So Francisco Ferrer was born in 1859 in a small town outside of Barcelona. He started his political career as a Republican, which is not the same thing as a Republican today. Don't worry. Back then, it basically meant someone who wanted a republic instead of a monarchy. So he was involved in the Republican movement in the 1880s, and basically the Republican movement was entirely detached from popular movements, the working class. Their goal was, hey, to get a republic, let's win over a couple of generals and get the military to do the work for us. So he was involved in planning all of these military conspiracies to get the Spanish military to turn on the king. They all failed, and so by the 1890s, he found himself in exile in France. If you're a Republican in the 1890s, you want to go to France, because France has the most revered republic of the era, the Third Republic. But he gets to France, and he's not so happy about the republic. Why not? Because in his opinion, there's still poverty, and when it comes to the educational system, he talks about how the French educational system simply replaced God with the state and the nation. Not happy with the French Republic. So he starts looking for other ways to be politically involved. He spends 5 minutes as a socialist. He's not too keen on that. And he gravitates towards anarchism, especially in the context of a kind of rebirth of revolutionary syndicalism in France. Okay. What else is he doing? He's got to earn a living, right? So he teaches Spanish, even though he was born in Catalonia and he speaks Catalan, and we can talk about the relationship with the Catalan language later on. He teaches Spanish. One of his students is a very rich woman whose father earned a fortune through the process of housemanization. So if there's any European history dorks here, you may know what that is. If not, you have no idea what that is. In mid-19th century in France, the government decides to knock down all these small, poor, working-class areas and create enormous boulevards so it would be easier to suppress revolts, and so it would be more quote-unquote hygienic. So her father makes a crap load of money renovating the city. She inherits it. Ferrer becomes her teacher, and he says, hey, you have all this money. Why don't we do something good for it, like open a school? So she writes into her will to give much of her fortune to Ferrer to create this school, and then she dies about a year later, which is kind of mysterious. I'm not saying there's anything foul play there, but it is, for this story, quite a coincidence. I'm just saying that. So a year later, she dies. He comes back to Barcelona in 1901 and opens the Modern School. So, what's the deal with this school? Ferrer was identifying increasingly with anarchism, and if you read his private correspondence, he says, I want this school to be internally libertarian, without broadcasting it externally. Now, libertarian was a synonym with anarchism in many languages. It still is. Right-wing free market capitalists tried to take it in English language, yada yada. Internally libertarian. But what did he mean by that? A lot of what Ferrer's school has been based off of the book that he wrote in 1908, which Rob mentioned, which was translated into English in 1913 as The Origins and Ideals of the Modern School. Actually, that translation is only 2/3 of the original book. This is the first English translation of the whole book. And while I'm on plugging the book, I'm going to talk a little bit about more what's in the book. It has a lot of different writings and private correspondence about the book and other things. So, what about this school? Ferrer had his vision of radical pedagogy was different than you might expect. I think that most of us, when we think of radical pedagogy, radical education, we think about trying to break down barriers for individuals to pursue their education. In his mind, it was less about form and more about content. He thought that basically, again, he was very much steeped in a kind of Enlightenment positivist notion of truth. And he thought basically the goal is sort of like, in an almost surgical metaphor, to surgically remove error from the minds of the young and replace it with truth derived from a rational interrogation of the natural world. So he was very much this kind of empiricist, natural world, Enlightenment-type thinker. And we can talk about all the limitations of that when we will. So that was sort of how he saw education. But he also made a number of innovations over time. He argued against grades. He argued against rewards and punishments. Although, as the book shows, early on, the school did have grades. Not only did it have grades, it actually published the grades in the school newspaper, which just gives you a sense of the kind of public-private nature of education, along sometimes with commentary about how students were lazy, they needed to apply themselves more. That's in there, too. You can read exactly what they said, along with pictures so you can figure out who the kids actually are in the pictures, which I spent a while doing. But they got rid of that after a year. They also initially enlisted how often the students were late in the newspaper. And you hear school newspaper, you'd imagine that, oh, it'd be like this class did a project. It really has nothing about the classes. It's all basically intellectual theory about education. It's more from Rousseau than it does from the teachers. Over time, though, it did start to embrace some of these anti-authoritarian ideals, getting rid of grades, being coeducational, which for the time was a huge deal in Spain, where the educational system was pretty much run by the especially reactionary Catholic Church. Now I'm just going to, we'll talk more about the school, but I'm just going to kind of wrap up the chronology of Ferrer's life so you have a sense of where this is fitting in. So Ferrer got all this money. He put a lot of the money towards the school. He didn't only put the money towards the school. He did a bunch of other stuff too. So publicly, Ferrer said, I reject any dogmatism. I reject any school of political thought. I am only about rationality and the truth, which he saw as an entirely objective pursuit. Privately, that wasn't what he thought. He put a lot of money into organizing a kind of rejuvenated revolutionary syndicalist movement. He funded the creation of a paper called the General Strike, which became the mouthpiece of the Anarchist Labor Federation in Barcelona in the middle of a especially fierce general strike in 1902. And in that newspaper, he wrote under a pen name, Zero, which was also his Masonic name. If you have any Freemason questions, we'll get to them later. He wrote under his pen name in a much more explicitly anarchist and much more explicitly revolutionary tone. One of his articles, which I translated and reproduced in the book, is titled, Will There Be Blood? ? Yes, a lot. You can't get more explicit in a title. Where basically his argument is you might as well not have a revolutionary general strike if you're not going to prepare for the seizure of power. So you have this interesting public-private dichotomy. Privately, fierce revolutionary who's ready for the barricades. Publicly, education. In his mind, that wasn't a contradiction because he saw the rational pursuit of the empirical natural world as necessarily leading to the abolition of capital, the state, etc., etc., etc. He also was involved in a few other things. So, as I mentioned, in his youth, he was a revolutionary Republican who was involved in these conspiracies to overthrow the government. And, you know, things that you're involved with when you're young, they die hard, right? So he continued to be interested in that. And so he was accused of being part of two conspiracies to kill the Spanish king. One occurred in 1905 when King Alfonso XIII was visiting Paris, and someone threw a couple of bombs at his carriage. He survived. Ferrer, there's some minor evidence to suggest he was involved. For example, he wrote a letter to one of the conspirators saying the date is set for May 30th, which happened to be the day that the king was arriving. But there is no tangible evidence to link him to that, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. There's a lot more evidence to suggest that he was involved with a similar conspiracy a year later in 1906 when there's a lot more details in there, but basically the king was having a wedding. The Spanish king was getting married to an English princess, and as they were riding home from the wedding in their carriage, the head of the Modern School Publishing House, so basically one of Ferrer's comrades, threw a bouquet of flowers at the royal couple with a bomb in it, and it exploded, not hurting the royal couple, hurting some police and bystanders nearby. His name was Mateo Moral. He was really tight politically with Francisco Ferrer. Ferrer sent a very large check to the guy who helped Moral escape. I think that Ferrer was involved in that conspiracy because above all else, he was a revolutionary who really wanted to create a rupture, to create a new world. And so basically what I'm getting at here is Ferrer was a complicated figure who had very different political sides and had short, medium, and long-term views of revolutionary change. Long-term, he thought that the way to change society was to educate young people, not even explicitly through a proletarian lens, but he argued for the need for cross-class education. Medium-term, he argued for building working-class power through labor federations. And short-term, he wanted to kill the king to get rid of the monarchy right now. And so he's a kind of confusing, complex political character. The end of the story is that he's charged as an accomplice for this bombing. He actually gets acquitted. He goes into exile, comes back, and he's around in 1909 when the tragic week rebellion happens. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about rebellion, about his death, and then I'll hand it over to Rob, and we'll open it up to conversations about education. What was the tragic week rebellion? So the once great, quote-unquote, Spanish Empire lost many of its colonies. In the early 19th century, it lost a few more in the War of 1898 with the United States. But in 1909, still held a piece of Morocco. French held another piece. There's an anti-colonial insurgency in 1909. The Spanish government does what colonial powers do and sent in the army. Spain had a conscript army. That means it conscripted poor and working class people. And if you were rich, you could literally pay your way out of serving in the military. So what happened is in Barcelona, a port city, these conscripts are getting ready to go over and fight in a war that they have no interest in fighting in. And this group of rich women show up to give out little medals to the soldiers as they're getting on a boat. And the soldiers have enough, they throw the medals in the water and they say, let the rich go, we're not going. This leads to the call for a general strike. It leads into a kind of anti-clerical insurrection where dozens of churches and convents are burnt down. There's a whole lot more details to that. I guess the point. Uprising happens. Ferrer is charged as the mastermind, not one of the masterminds, but the mastermind of the rebellion, and is executed. There is no evidence whatsoever that he had anything to do with it, although he really wished he were the mastermind. That's the thing. He showed up to the leaders of all the different factions of the rebellion, the syndicalists, the Republicans, everyone, trying to sort of parlay about his vision of the revolution, and none of them wanted to talk to him. They all just were like, I'm too busy, I don't want to talk to you. The Republicans thought he was a little too much of an anarchist. The anarchists thought he was a little bit too much of a Republican. He fell between the cracks and had no influence whatsoever, yet he was blamed and executed. If the story had stopped there, it would have been interesting, but what makes this a big deal historically are two things. One, there's a massive protest movement that spreads across Europe, North, South America, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, over the execution of a school teacher. It involves general strikes, insurrections. In his memory, statues are created, streets are renamed after him in many different countries. And you have the Modern School movement, which is a movement to create more or less Ferrerian schools around the world. China, Japan, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Argentina, Puerto Rico, around the world. What's interesting about that, though, is that people had relatively little information to go off of, and so the basic ideas were interpreted in a wide variety of directions, which makes it interesting. One of the most long-lasting schools was in Stelton, New Jersey, not too far from here. We can talk about that more a little later. So, again, Ferrer, this kind of complex figure, revolutionary, involved in all sorts of political revolutionary ventures, not quite easily classified into any one school of thought, who created this school that was shut down in 1906 when he was charged with being the mastermind of this rebellion, but inspired the creation of hundreds of schools around the world over the coming decades. So,
can you highlight really quickly about why you retranslate?
Yeah, so Rob's like, why did you go through the effort of retranslating all this stuff? My partner asked me the same question every day for a long period of time. One is that the original book that Ferrer wrote, only 2/3 of it was translated in 1913 by Joseph McCabe. Moreover, he was of the school of thought that I mentioned in the beginning that wanted to portray Ferrer as this purely neutral, rationalistic figure. He was British. He was writing for a British audience, a middle-class, moderate audience that wanted to see in Ferrer that guy. So when Ferrer would talk about riots, McCabe would translate it as meetings, as one example. And there's a few other examples throughout. So the tone, he tried to soften Ferrer's language. I wanted to return it to its original. And then the book has a lot more than that. It also has articles from Ferrer, some of the other teachers, collaborators of the Modern School from the newspaper. And probably most importantly, it has articles written by other anarchists during the era who were highly critical of his educational vision, mainly because they argued there should be no truly anarchist education. One of the writers said there should be neither anarchists, nor monarchists, nor socialists, that education shouldn't be ideological. So that was the sort of basic debate within the anarchist milieu was, is the goal to teach anarchism, parentheses, because anarchism is the truth? Or is the goal to leave a sort of neutral education for students, parentheses, because they'll get to anarchism on their own? So those are basically the two arguments. I think they're both flawed, so we can talk about why that is. And then also there's writings from figures like Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Rudolf Rocker about him, his legacy, and so forth. And it's also some of his more juicy revolutionary writings are in there, and probably some stuff that I forgot. So, yeah, a lot of what the Modern School book is, and a lot of what the school did was about hygiene, which may sound irrelevant, but this is an era when popular education around hygiene and avoiding disease through cleaning and so forth was sort of a new idea, at least in the context of Barcelona. And so when they're thinking of working with students of different class backgrounds, that's probably, in terms of actually affecting their lives, the most tangible thing that they could have done.
So I just want to kind of touch on a few things. And part of it, I kind of want to spark a conversation, if that's okay. During this time, we have to understand, too, around the world, and also from Ferrer's standpoint, he actually is pulling from a lot of people, right? He's pulling mostly from folks from France in terms of some of the schools that were developing over there. But I want to highlight some other things that were going on during, at least in context, not particularly from the book, but thinking about here in the United States, we already had John Dewey that was basically thinking about progressive education really in the late 1800s, right, 1890s. We start thinking about how young people learn, or how people learn in general. And I think what I like about the context of the book, and if you look at some of the sections, is the conversation that many are having about what we do. And Mark kind of laid that out. Is like, do we basically have a sort of revolutionary curriculum that people follow and these sorts of things, or do we get these sorts of, have these kids basically, or have kids be able to kind of suss out for themselves these ideas and how they work through them? And I think there's a lot of context in terms of the history of the United States specifically, in terms of free schools and those sorts of things. And I think part of it, getting back to Mark's point, is that Judith Suissa wrote in her book, really, that anarchists have been really naive to pedagogy. She says that at a certain point. I think that's important, because I think a lot of us try to, quote unquote, dabble in the sort of relationship between the student and the teacher, and really how kids learn, and really don't have a lot of that connection or understanding of it. We've learned a lot from then, right? But we a lot of times continue to do the same sort of things, right? In some of our movements and some of our other things. But I think, for me at least, some of the discussions in the book help us give examples of what conversations we're having then. You can even look at some of Emma Goldman's work too, later on, where she wrote in 1906, "The Child and Its Enemies." And it's like a 9-page piece. You can download it for free. So, but it really kind of puts into context these ideas that we need. And she critiques the left in terms of how we need to let children be what they are, no matter who they are, and kind of put them in that sort of light. And they always use a metaphor. A lot of them use the metaphor of the plant, right? We put the plant in the sunlight in order for it to grow. If it doesn't like sunlight, we're going to put the plant over into the shade. We should be doing the same thing with children. And I think part of that too, I think, again, that push for that rationalist educational process is a huge problem because it runs into some issues. First off, that education is not neutral, right? It's like it comes to the point where when you start thinking about how education, for me at least, and I wrote at the end of it and afterwards, like we need to be transparent about our sort of teaching and learning practices, specifically with young people, right? And so I think with Ferrer is that we begin to start seeing that he wasn't privy to some of those conversations, and he's trying to pull in some of these ideas and make them work, right? And as Mark mentioned, the idea that shifting from grades and shifting from these sorts of things is sort of transforming the school on the sort of fly in some cases, and especially from some of the ideas that are coming out. So, but I think there's a larger context of what was happening internationally, specifically in Europe and in the U.S., and I think in other parts too, is like what is education? How do people learn? And I think part of that too, and I think we'll move into sort of that conversation is, can we have a rationalist sort of education process with folks? And I think from Ferrers, there's some problems, and again, you can read some of the discussions that were highlighted there. But for me at least, is that we have to come to the point that education is not neutral. Right? That's the beginning point, at least, from going from there and being transparent. I know with my own kids, I begin to start thinking about how I come to certain elements, specifically, in some cases, talking about using power in certain situations, like talking to my students, hey, I'm going to use my power here to talk about certain ideas in the classroom or front load certain ideas about this, as opposed to I'm just going to do this on you, right? So I think that's one thing that comes out. But I think for me at least, part of this sort of process and project for me at least is for us to have conversations historically about what practices have been going on educationally, and then also where might we begin to go and what sort of the process that we can begin to think about the work that we do in our movements and our everyday practices, and even some of our spaces, right, that we operate in. And because education is a relationship, right? And I think in the book it really kind of highlights those sorts of things, that the complex ideas of what education, the conversation about education should be. And so I think coming over to the United States, you begin to start seeing how that played out in terms of those educational practices. Do we have kids being able to do what we want to do? If you look at some of the Stelton schools, they kind of had some rigid aspects too. If you look at some of the aspects that go on initially, you had some conversations, some tensions between, some of the people that were living on the commune, in terms of working together, and should we have a socialist or a communist? And so there's all sorts of different sort of conversations that are going on. And I think, for me at least, these examples give us sort of spaces that we can go, here's what we can learn from this and move in different directions. Here's some sort of contemporary spaces and how they've connected. I have to say something too. In the Anarchist pedagogy book, there's actually a school in Spain that was actually been around since 1978, and there's actually, it's like kind of a more of a case study of vignettes and those things in the piece. But it's really looking at trying to continue to implement these types of ideas that were flowing through the modern schools in Spain, but trying to put that in practice for quite some time. In fact, the school in that situation that had been around since 1978, they kicked the parents out because the parents were being too authoritarian. They actually kick the students out of that school. So, and basically said, we'll run it just fine. So I think there's some interesting conversations about pedagogy, but also what's the relationship between the teacher and student. I think that we lose sight of, especially when we're trying to educate with others, right, and not on others, as Paulo Freire says. But I think there's something that's really interesting that comes out. So historically, we have these sort of pieces that I think that are helpful for people to actually engage in those conversations, as opposed to leaving it in the historical context and not talking about it today. So I kind of want to open it up to any questions in terms of ideas of problems, in terms of if anybody's read the book, but originally, but also kind of give us a sort of sense of what are some discussions in terms of your own pedagogical practice, if you're teachers out there or whatever, in terms of how do we teach kids, especially within a radical sort of, like, we want to move sort of people in different directions, but at the same time we want to be free. So those sorts of things start kind of taking the precedence. So my thoughts, and you can read in the sort of ideas that we got to get a sense of desire. First, we want to have a desire to be free, but also to learn, and also to be able to push some of these ideas in different ways, but also being transparent, because a lot of times we aren't transparent in terms of the work that we're trying to do with others. So I'll leave it there, but I think checking out this book can really help us kind of continue the conversation that sometimes gets left off when books get shoved to the wayside historically. So I'll leave it there unless Mark, you want to add something.
We can just basically open it up for, because we want to know what you all want to talk about. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, just to clarify one of the things that you said that one of the things he wanted to do was to create a rupture. And then you talk about then how, in response to his death, you had a massive protest movement and a modern school movement.
Yes.
Do you think that that was the rupture that he wanted to create, or how does that fit in with the short-term, medium, and long-term goal? I mean, that's a loaded question, but
no, understood. So, imagining what he would have thought about the movement and protest of his death, I think he would have been happy there was a movement and protest of his death. He said he did not want monuments to himself. He didn't want placards for himself. Yet they happened anyway. I'm sure he would have been happy about other schools trying to pick up his educational mission, that's for sure, even if a lot of them were very different from what he had in mind. What I meant by the rupture is that, rightly or wrongly, depending on your politics, he was willing to compromise quite a bit in order to open up space for radical possibility. So one of his friends, after he was dead, said he was the type of anarchist who would have been happy with a Republican government as kind of a transitional stage towards an anarchist society, which would have been anathema to 99.9% of the anarchist movement, but he was sort of a kind of Republican anarchist, if that is a possibility. And what's interesting is that these kinds of, this is another project I'm working on, but these revolutionary conspiracies, first decade of the 20th century, featured a kind of heterogeneous network of revolutionary Republicans, Freemasons, like Cuban nationalists, anarchists, who, it reminds me of that, like, that Twitter meme with, like, the two hands and the fist, right? All these different figures and, like, overthrowing the monarchy. And so they could put everything else away in order to do that. And that was what he was interested in, because he figured if you could just at least get the monarchy out of the way, then we could get the ball rolling. And in the context of the Republican movement in Spain, that made some sense, because the figurehead of the monarch was holding together a system that was kind of teetering and that would fall. Well, I mean, it teetered so much that by 1923 they implemented a dictatorship, but I digress. In the back? You, yes. You, yeah.
I'm kind of following along with that. How much of an influence do you think Francisco Ferrer had on the 1936 revolution? Like the anarchists?
Good question. Actually, a fair amount. So, a lot that's been written about the modern school movement in English emphasizes, for example, Paul Avrich did a great book about it in the United States. There's been work written about elsewhere, but actually the country where it had the biggest movement was in Spain itself, because the CNT, the Anarchist Union, basically picked up Ferrer's educational mission, changed a few things here and there, and the schools that they created were basically Ferrerian schools. So in that way, a fair number of people who were in the anarchist movement in the Spanish Civil War were educated through some variation of Ferrerian education. What's interesting is that the anarchist movement of 36 believed that, well, initially they didn't put the Juventudes Libertarias, the anarchist youth, out to fight in the war because they believed that a young generation should exist that's not scarred by war to create the new society. They gave that up once things were going bad, but that gives you some sense of sort of the complex relationship between anarchism and violence, which is most anarchists of that era believed, there were notable exceptions, most believed that a revolution was necessary, but that it scarred the people who were part of it permanently.
Yeah, really interesting to hear all this. I've been working on the Modern School in Stelton, and I'd be really glad to hear what you have to say about that. I've actually been going to the Friends of the Modern School reunion for a while, and it's really fascinating to see how the people there have been so shaped by this education that happened 50, 60 years ago. I guess my question is a separate one, which is, it strikes me that people, like even in the Goldman and Berkman, they kind of projected on Ferrer what they wanted to see.
Everyone did.
He became this sort of like zealot figure who was kind of everything to everybody, and I just wonder if you could talk about that, and if there were projections that were just totally wrong, and he would have been not cool with. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, so the question, if anyone couldn't hear in the back, was basically, in short, figures like Berkman and Goldman projected a lot onto Ferrer, comment on that, and were the things that were projected onto him that he wouldn't have liked, and so forth. So that was very common for people to project things onto Ferrer, both because he was so multifaceted that you could project a lot and be right, also because a lot of people, especially outside of Western Europe, had very little to go off of him. Much of it was second or third hand. And so I've been to some of the Modern School reunion events in New Jersey, and I did a presentation that's not that different from this several years ago about Ferrer, and the folks there who were students back in the day didn't really know about a lot of this history, and they said that they didn't really talk a lot about Ferrer. So even for this epitome of Ferrerian school, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was several layers removed from this stuff. And that's because people didn't have a lot of information. So in that way, and I mean, you could make a sort of meta-argument about political symbols in general, that they are projections, they're containers that we put what we want into them, and historically they often get so far away from where they started out that they mean something different anyway. That was certainly the case with Ferrer. Do you want to add anything about Stelton?
No, I would actually, I would recommend actually going online and checking out their archives on there. There's some really interesting works, and I always think about this, and I haven't done any research on it, but a lot of the linoleum sort of block prints they have in some of the art books some of the pieces that they have. But I really enjoy some of the writings of the young children. There's actually some interesting, insightful sort of discussions about. There's one piece that I actually use in class that I think she's 14. I can't remember the woman's name, the young girl's name, but she basically talks about art and aesthetics and how people look at art from a different perspective, and how the art teacher shouldn't be telling her how to basically make a face or draw a dog or something like that, and the parents always coming in there and talking about how they want to impose certain ideas of what the dog or the face should look like, in terms of their own sort of background. So it's really, if you take a look at it, it's a really interesting archive to look at really some of the, and if you read some of the children's sort of stories, you can kind of get some sense of A, what they're learning, but B, kind of the sort of freedom to be able to kind of tap into different sort of creative spaces. And again, I like some of the linoleum sort of block prints that they have. And in fact, I play music, and I actually used some of their pieces. In fact, Out of the Ruins book that I co-edited, I used one of the block prints from them, which is it's kind of a sunflower on the front of it. And I really like the work that they do, but I also like some of the context of the creativity that goes involved with the book. because it does remind me of some of the stuff that I've done with my own students, and it wasn't until I looked at that I was like, so that's what I was doing. I was pulling in some historical aspect where we actually had to create a block print for school, and because we couldn't afford to get something nice done at the the printer, so we said, well, let's do block prints on the front of each book, and so I'm like, I think I've seen that in other places, so I was able to like kind of see where I got the idea from, so it's really helpful. So you can definitely take a look at some of those things, and also piggybacking on Mark's sort of ideas, like I get emails from people, and in fact, someone just did a linoleum print or a piece for me from Canada on Francisco Ferrer's sort of death, and it has him basically, shackled, but it has like a flower growing out of his, he's on the ground, there's a flower growing out, and he has a very romanticized idea of what Ferrer's sort of the idea, and still in modern day, like thinking about him just from what he's read from Emma Goldman, from Voltaire, all those sort of folks that basically give some sort of insights that, oh yes, we need to see this person as, and I think with what Mark's done, I think in the sort of historical context, which is actually helpful for me because my students then also get a really deeper understanding of who this person was, a more complex person, that he wasn't just this, he was a lot of things, and I think it definitely lays out in the introduction the sort of beginning piece that helps put into context who he was.
Just to add one other thing to that is, well, first, as far as I can tell, and I have not done extensive research on the Stelton colony. The Stelton colony was basically like Burning Man compared to this. The students had so much freedom to decide when they wanted to learn, what they wanted to learn, what they wanted to do. This book, it shows like there was like a fairly regular schedule, like 1 from 2, we're doing math. And if you don't like it, sorry. So very different perspective. The one thing just that reminded me of the question of projecting onto Ferrer is there's an anecdote in the book that feels very much like an equivalent could happen today. Ferrer's dead. The almost entire French political spectrum raises him up as a martyr of anti-clericalism primarily. And there are these commemoration meetings where basically these like Republican generals and police officials are commemorating Ferrer, and the French anarchists are just losing their mind. Because they're like, if you were alive, you would have killed him. And so there are debates and arguments that break out in these commemoration meetings. So that's just, an example of that plan. Right here, and then we'll go in the back.
Just to add, in the basement of the Alexander Library at Rutgers University, you can literally hold all of the original lino prints from the magazine was called Voice of the Children that they did at Stelton. Or if you Google Rutgers University Modern School, you can look at some copies of it. My question is, the main difference between an environment like Stelton compared to Ferrer in Barcelona, in my mind, is not even just the freedom of schedule, but the fact that the children were living in a community. And if you compare that to an environment like Summerhill, not to say that that's necessarily anarchistic, but where it's self-directed, that opens up kind of what you're talking about as far as maybe not something that's neutral, but it being a life rather than an education. It's no longer about a teacher and a student, but it's about people living together. I'm just curious, was that ever a conversation in Ferrer's time, or was it always just focusing very much on a school?
So for him, it was about a school. The Modern School was located in a fairly affluent neighborhood of Barcelona. In Barcelona, in the first decade of the 20th century, for a child to go to school, that already was sort of a class status because working class children worked. You had to pay to attend, but it was sliding scale. The goal was for it to be cross-class education, but again, the fact that you could attend already meant something about your class background. He wanted to open a night school for adults. It didn't work out. Later on, the C&T schools had night classes for working people. During the same era, there was an anarchist orphanage in France organized by Sebastian Faure called the Beehive, and so that would be probably more analogous.
Ferrer.
Sebastian Faure, different guy.
What
yeah.
was Ferrer not at the Beehive?
No, because that was in France, and it opened, I think, in 1906, and for I think was in prison when it opened. The details are a little fuzzy, but that would be closer. I haven't looked extensively into that, but that would be more analogous. But yeah, it's completely different if you're living together like that. Do you want to jump in on that, or?
No, I agree. I mean, in terms of
Yeah, and also, I mean, again, he was sort of the opinion that if you could just teach the kids the right way, that'd be enough. But that having been said, there's some articles in there where they try to appeal to the parents and how the parents interact with the kids to get them to be more kind and understanding. There's also one bit in the newspaper about, so if any of you have been to Spain or Latin America, you know, the dos besos, the kisses, greeting on the cheeks, the Modern School newspaper had a thing about how it was unjust to force children to do that, because children should have autonomy to decide how they want to greet people, and that it was unhygienic. So, you know, there was an effort to try to permeate the wider society, but not exactly enough. And in the back, yeah.
Yeah, first off, thank you both of you for coming here tonight to speak to us. And I have a twofold question. Number one, can you explore a little bit more the relation that Rousseau's influence on Ferrer? And secondly, what were anarchist receptions to this? Because Bakunin famously wrote a polemic against Rousseau. So I'm curious if you can answer the second part. I'm not sure what the first one.
You want to talk Rousseau?
I hear the first part of the question. What was it?
The influence Rousseau had on Ferrer's thinking, and then the reception by other anarchists of Ferrer using Rousseau. As I was saying earlier, that Bakunin wrote a famous polemic against Rousseau, and later on Rocker goes on to write a polemic against Rousseau in nationalism and culture as well. So
Yeah, I probably don't want to go. I want to start basic. Well, I first want to say, like, let's see where I can start with that, because that's a long sort of process. I'm just going to tackle the idea of enlightenment, right? It's the idea that basically we have Ferrer's ideas of a sort of rationalist education. You had Kropotkin, the integral sort of part of the education, those sort of things. A lot of that was based upon this sort of rationalist thinking, right, in terms of Rousseau's ideas, right? So, and also enlightenment in general. And really, from what we see now, what we talk about is a sort of positivist sort of aspect, right? And he uses the terminology in the book, or in his writings, and really thinking about, like, if we just do this rational sort of process, we can get kids to be this, right? Or if we take these sort of ideas out of this, then basically we can have them move towards these sort of ideas. So I think with the Enlightenment period, and we saw this even in the U.S. too as well, right, where you had a lot of the sort of scientific management aspect or scientific sort of rationalist sort of ideas, like we basically go from one idea to the next and basically come up with a sort of concrete outcome, right? And the problem is that human beings aren't always rational, right, in terms of things. And I think that's where a lot of, I think in practice, and I guess let me bring that into sort of play, is bringing that into practice always comes into some sort of conflict with it in terms of, like, resistance from students, right, in terms of how they perceive their sort of movement in sort of education. And I guess from that sort of rationalist idea is how do we begin to start seeing, like, who has that sort of truth, right? Who has that sort of idea of what truth is? And I'm not going to go into Bakunin's part, but I want to make sure that, like, anarchists, like, in terms of, or in terms of an anarchist pedagogy, if you think about it, would contest a lot of what Ferrer is talking about, specifically because of that sort of that linear sort of thinking. And Rocker talked about the ideas that that anarchism is fluid, right? The notion that anarchism has that fluidity, so it has that ability to kind of maneuver around different spaces, be able to kind of contest in different sort of areas in terms of spaces. So I think with Ferrer, it's like this sort of, if you just take the dogmatism, what he talks about is dogmatism out of education, the ideology out of education, we can begin to then replace it with something, with what we want, right, in terms of which is rationalist thinking. And I think that comes up to some problems even to today, right? I mean, in terms of our own thinking about education, because if we look at the sort of Enlightenment period and how it's played out today, we can kind of see how education, again, we come to the notion that education is not neutral. We can then begin to sort of unpack where also be transparent about what we're doing with it. And for me, at least, the Enlightenment period, like, again, I'm not going to go into sort of post-structuralist anarchists and those sorts of things that came at a later date, but those sort of discussions questioned some of those sort of Enlightenment rationalist thinking at the time. And Ferrer basically was trying to maneuver in that. He was trying to use it because that's really what was happening. I mean, even up until like most of the thinking in terms of Emma Goldman to Berkman had that sort of idea, that sort of rationalist sort of way of thinking, projecting that sort of thing. If we just, and that's what I think gets back to my first saying about Judith Suissa, saying that anarchists are naive to sort of pedagogy, right? And that's part of that sort of questioning what the modern school is doing and trying to kind of piece together, well, what is it that we can do differently to contest that? And that's what I try to write in the afterward, is like, really, can we have that sort of neutral, objective sort of education system that rationalist thinking can kind of develop? So again, I'm kind of all over the place, but just because I think there's questions that I'm getting in my head, all the things that I want to say, but it's like, I really think that it's sort of, we can kind of look at education as political, right? And also as, in many cases, moving beyond that sort of rationalist sort of thinking about education. Because I think that you see in the mid 20th century that split kind of goes off, especially when you start looking in the sort of mid-century, in the 60s and 70s, and those sorts of question about rationalist thinking, logic, those sorts of things, specifically from the sort of some of the French philosophers that later on that some anarchists now have talked about too as well.
Just a quick thing on that is also that there was the first director of the Modern School was a woman named Clémencia Jacquinet, who was university educated. Ferrer had stopped his formal education at the age of 13. And when they started discussing what to do with the school, she was very insistent on the students reading the classics, and I'm 90% sure that one of the ones she insisted on was Rousseau. Ferrer was very adamant that the students shouldn't read this old garbage. It's old, it's a product of the old thinking, and he was looking for really recent writers. So that having been said, the Modern School Bulletin does have some excerpts from Rousseau, but I'm pretty sure that Ferrer never took the time to really read Rousseau. He was probably in some ways indirectly influenced by Rousseau in the sense of being influenced by people who read Rousseau, but he was very much like, who's writing now? What's the new school of thought? So he went to England, he went to France, looking for recent books to translate into Spanish for students there. Who else has a question, comment? Let's go all the way over there. Yes, hi. That was it. Yeah. So there is a very strong, essentially, colonial foundation to all of this, right? There are explicit examples of it. So, for example, the Modern School had Sunday lectures where they would bring in professors from the university or scholars to discuss a topic. The students could attend, the parents could attend, the community could attend. And one of the presenters talked about Christopher Columbus as this sort of great, explorer. So like there wasn't really a critique of that. I don't have any specific quotes from Ferrer offhand, but some of his collaborators, when they talked about colonized peoples, they would be critical of colonialism for being authoritarian, but not challenge the Western notion of the quote-unquote savage or the quote-unquote backward. So they didn't, that overwhelming majority of Europeans, radicals or not, during this era and today, really, have that foundation, and their radical critique only went so far. That's true, of course, of explicit political things. It's also entirely embedded in the perspectives on truth and rationality and science. And you can also see that their confidence in what they believed truth to be and their confidence in what they thought science to be and rationality made them less reflective about all this other crap than they ought to have been, obviously. When it comes to hygiene, they just saw that as kind of a variation on science. So those critiques are completely dead on, and that's one of the main limitations of this kind of work. That having been said, you know, it's important to learn from, but it's also important to learn how colonial this all was. So yes, that's completely right on. Yes.
Were there, as far as models for teaching in the classroom, like, were there significant contrasts on that level between different modern schools that were emerging? And were there also contrasts between that and more modern schools? How do you kind of like mechanically break down that relationship?
So I'm going to address the first part of it, and then I'll hand it off for the second. So what was the teaching like? We get glimpses from the school newspaper, we get glimpses from Ferrer's book, but not a really thorough dig in. Ferrer himself doesn't seem to have been a classroom teacher at all. He was sort of an organizer, administrator. Some of the anecdotes we get about classroom activities revolve around, for example, teaching the students about how to wash, again, hygiene, teaching the students about how to sing, how to draw, how to write. They talk about recreation, where they say it's important to let the students go outside and make all sorts of wild noises, quote unquote, to let them blow off steam, which for the time was a big deal, right? Because in disciplinary and Catholic education, that wouldn't have been the case. There is certainly, you know, this is all, history is about context. Compared to other schools in Barcelona, the students were basically, you know, it was like a paradise. Based on what we think about as radical pedagogy now, it was very ordered and kind of strict and very targeted in what the activity was, targeted in what the norms and the goals of the activity were. They were trying to produce certain kinds of students. They had field trips, so they went a lot of outdoor nature excursions, and another kind of aside is that the anarchist movement in Spain at this time also has kind of a natural streak to it, especially in urban areas, to get out into nature. One of the field trips they go on is to a factory. So going back to my earlier biographical thing, Mateo Moral, the 1906 bomber who was the administrator of the Modern School Publishing House, his dad was a wealthy factory owner, and so that's the factory that the students of the Modern School went to. It's a chapter in Ferrer's book talks about that. He didn't mention whose school it was because that was after the bombing. I mentioned whose school it was. And on the tour, basically, Mateo Moral, who will a couple years later attempt to kill the king, shows the students all the machines and, you know, talks about essentially the potential of industry to create plenty for a future libertarian communist society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we get glimpses. Ferrer, if you read the book, talks a lot about what educational spaces should be like, what the content should be. He's less interested in what the actual kind of texture of teaching would be like. Now, as far as anarchist pedagogy writ large, I'll hand it off.
Yeah, what can you ask the second part of the question? I got tinnitus, so I went to too many shows growing up, so now my hearing's shot.
I was wondering, and I guess the answer to the first question changes it a little bit. Were there contrasts that you could point to between models for teaching that different modern schools were interested in, and more kind of newer modern anarchist pedagogy?
Yeah, and I think that's, for me at least, the point of most of the work that I try to put out there. I want to find examples of what people are doing to develop non-hierarchical anti-authoritarian, mutual, and can't forget the term voluntary educational spaces, right? People forget that voluntary aspect sometimes. But and I think that, again, I think there's a lot of people, and a lot of you might be involved with, educational spaces, in your own sort of work. But for me, it's always something that it comes back to some of the things me growing up. Like for me, I went to a public school. Like so, I went to in Southern California, in Orange County, but my kind of informal learning is through punk music, right? So I grew up, listening to punk music and learning about El Salvador and Nicaragua through punk lyrics, right? So that informal sort of space and radical spaces that I was, involved with helped me better understand, like, what I was learning in school and how I can contest that, right? But, I think Mark and I were talking about it, in one of our interviews recently, is like, we don't have, the larger capacity to have modern schools everywhere, across the country, right? I mean, that's not the reality right now. So what are some of those spaces, and that's for me those interesting sort of parallels of trying out these different examples and then seeing how, and then also critically reflecting on what those actually mean for us, right? As educators, as people in communities, and those sorts of things. Because when you talk about the sort of non-Western sort of the decolonizing movement, it brings me back to it's like almost reciprocal of like living in Salt Lake City. I was just thinking about it, of learning about the sort of resistance movements in northern Nevada with the Western Shoshone Defense Project that I learned about really through basically meeting some of the folks and then going out there, but then also through punk music. And so those informal spaces, but they're also sometimes, they also have this sort of sharing of ideas. Like so, me going to certain info spaces like this and learning about it, and then trying to find out more, or trying to find out, developing sort of reading, discussion groups and those things, and then also, I think the main thing is acting upon those ideas, right? It is really kind of thinking through is like how can we act on those ideas, and for me, I think in contemporary times, I think there's a lot of parallels we can start seeing of examples. I think not always evolving, because sometimes they digress in many cases, that I've seen in terms of the structure of some of the places I've been to, like for example, going playing in squats in Europe, seeing how kindergartens run in one squat is quite different than, let's say, another squat that I go to. That's like, oh, that's definitely not where people are going with that. But so you have these sort of intentional ideas, like, okay, how do we do this? And so I think there's a lot of really interesting examples how we can see certain ways of doing that. Not only just in sort of developing these formal intentional spaces, but also developing these sort of informal spaces that I think can, to me, outwork some of the formal aspects, at least for me growing up, right? I mean, in terms of going and learning about Reagan in public schools as opposed to learning about Reagan. I was just thinking about this band Beefeater, Reaganomics, and learning about Reaganomics through that band Beefeater from actually DC originally. So so that's the sort of thing that we can begin to start looking at, and I think part of that is seeing how these certain spaces evolve, and you can see this, like if you look actually after Ferrer's death. I'm working on a piece right now looking at sort of post 1914 of looking in the United States, of seeing philosophically how educational sort of ideas sort of turned out. Some of the actually teachers from the sort of modern school in Stelton began to have talks and debates and discussions about like what type of education do we need? Do we need to have the teacher there? Do we need to have more sort of control over the students? And sort of those conversations still went on. And I'm actually reading this piece from the 1940s and 50s, right? That continued on. And I think too, you can see that in a lot of spaces. The Zapatistas have some really interesting educational sort of work too that have arisen in terms of Zapatismo, where it actually talks about decolonization and anti-capitalism in their education system, in the process of educating young people. So there's definitely an intentional aspect going on with some of those sorts of things. So I think there's, again, for me at least, the most important thing is to actually have that work out there and put it into context, but as well as examples that people can read and like discuss, like how can we develop new sort of spaces for us to educate one another and our children, our communities, as opposed to looking at a sort of like, a sort of historical thing that's happened in the past. That for me, it's something that should be alive and here and continued on. So I mean, the space is definitely one of those spaces, right? That we can think about too. So hopefully that answers your question.
Right here.
I was curious about with the book, do you connect to like modern anarchistic versions of education, like the anarchistic free school, free university, like influenced by Colvin and Igor Illich type writings, where you can lay out the opportunities for writings on education and forwardness. I was wondering how you connect that to contemporary ideas of free school and very decentralized, not institutional forms of education.
Yeah. So you're asking how say it again. I'm sorry.
But basically, with the book, do you try to connect it to contemporary anarchist free schools as far as like that, or like an government influence versus the like less Republican influence versions of
for us, for the work that that mostly he did in terms of like is actually putting it out there, and for us at least, is putting Ferrer in context historically, right? I try to in the afterword develop the questions, like what is it, how do we create an anti-authoritarian, like what are those sort of questions, and sort of the things that I highlighted just before this, of just like how do we begin to look at Ferrer's work in contemporary times, what can we learn from him and the work in the schools that were going on at the time. And again, it's first off, we can understand it from a complex person that he was, in terms of I think it takes away sort of the martyrdom aspect of, for me at least, something that we can think about as a human being, and a more complex human being, but also just some of the historical aspects of, hey, this is radical for that time and that space. What is something that is radical and intentional in the spaces that we're operating now? And can we learn something from? We don't highlight that as much in the book, but I try to leave the question, at least from in the afterword, of the sort of conversation as that sort of develops. Is that, and then also with the free school, again, there's I think anarchists in general need to have more deeper conversations about educational practices, right? Because I don't think we've done enough to develop our praxis, our theory and practice, our development of connecting those things, or the intersection between those things. Because a lot of times, in some cases, and I've worked in spaces that they don't want to read about it, right? Or they don't. Hey, we're just going to do it. It's going to be spontaneous and those things. And Emma Goldman talks about that sort of spontaneity of education, or spontaneity of character in some of her pieces. But I think there's something there that we need to kind of tap into. I think I can't remember the guy's name, but the idea about anarchism is that sometimes it becomes a magpie of theory, right? And so, and some people point out, like a lot of people look at Paulo Freire's work, right, from Brazil, and how that supported many, some of the anarchist sort of ideas behind how you develop educational practices. That's some parts of it, but I think that has some holes in it too, right? Specifically these sort of linear aspects of, do we see, this idea that we're always becoming, but it's always becoming conscious, like developing consciousness in this sort of linear sort of way. And for me, it's like, well, people don't always work that way, especially from an educational standpoint. It's like we might learn something and we might progress in different ways, but on the other hand, we might digress, right? I've definitely seen people move out of, political movements and those sort of things because they read something different or change their sort of, ways of thinking, and sometimes not in good ways, right? So, but I also think that we also should think about how anarchism can, like how we can think about anarchism in terms of practice, what that looks like. And I think it gets back to the main beginning point, is that there's really no one anarchist pedagogy, right? It's situated, right? In many cases, that's why you see in terms of the Escuela Moderna in Spain is quite different than the modern school in Stelton, right? And also in different parts of the world. So, and that's a good thing, right? And that's, I think, is a good thing because it creates our spaces as situated as opposed to sort of linear and concrete. Does that make sense?
In your research, did you ever kind of see Ferrer grappling with the fact that, at least on the surface, the student-teacher relationship is kind of hierarchical, and it's kind of hard to make it sort of egalitarian in a lot of ways when you have someone with knowledge, someone seeking knowledge?
Right. For him, it was about primarily the knowledge. So if there was a teacher that was going to impart knowledge to a student, the student would receive that knowledge and then have that knowledge. Again, a lot of this is kind of a downer, right? I recognize that. As a historian, and as like a human being, it's important to be honest about this stuff. Understand it in its time and place. For its time and place, it was pretty rad. For its time and place, there's a lot of stuff that used to be kind of cool, and today we need to be critical of because of all these shortcomings. That having been said, he was a guy who was formally educated to the age of 13, who, prior to inheriting this money through a strange sequence of events from a rich woman who was a student, was like a pretty, working class guy. He had no training in educational theory. He sought out books about educational theory. He sought out educational theorists, put it together to make a school. All things in context. But yeah, he really wasn't super critical about that aspect of it. He just wasn't. Question? No? Anyone else? Let's go here, and then we'll go in the back. Yes?
This is a really good presentation. I love it.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure I want to read the book, but I was hoping you could make a couple of discernments for me to figure out if I want to read about Ferrer in the Modern School. Is Ferrer more of a Mr. Belding or a Principal Skinner type?
My memory of those shows is so incomplete that I
Welcome Back, Cotter, or Dead Poets Society.
Well, he was not a classroom guy, so I think that's probably a step towards answering that, right? And he didn't make any claims to being himself that innovative pedagogically. He was a guy who ended up, a lot of this is a story of money, really, because the ideas he was putting forth, the projects he was putting forth, had been tried by anarchists and like-minded people in France and other countries in previous years, and they fell apart because they didn't have funding. So he had the money, he had the space, he had the vision, he brought people together, and then went. So he wasn't as hands-on about it. I mentioned Clémencia Jacquinet was the first director of the Modern School. She left after the first year because she was of the opinion that education ought to be neutral, as she described it. And so she clashed with Ferrer around the kind of political angle. And I include in the book correspondence they had about that issue, like arguing about it. So that sort of was his role, was that he was more interested really in educational theory and educational content, putting this project into place. He put a lot of time into the Modern School Publishing House. So although there was one school in Barcelona, there were dozens of schools around the country that were using the Modern School books and that would continue to use them years forward. And also he spent a lot of other time funding unions, maybe planning insurrections. He was also involved in Freemasonry. He was also involved in what was called the Neo-Malthusian movement, which was essentially had two main facets. It was basically primarily about birth control and promoting birth control and reproductive autonomy among working class women. And the other part of it was an argument that the population had a global limit, and if it went too far, human capacities couldn't provide for the limit. So there was debate in the kind of anarchist movement around this. The other side said, no, if we reorganize how we allocate our resources, the population can grow to wherever. But those folks also were largely dismissive of the role of reproductive freedom. So again, historical debates are like that, right? So he was involved in that. He was involved in Freemasonry. He tried to create a sex ed class at the Modern School, but the parents freaked and he shut that down really quick. That, he was involved in a lot of stuff.
Thanks for the clarification.
You got it. So maybe take a couple more if there's any. Oh yes, one. And then before you ask rather, let's see if there's anyone else who wants to kind of get on stack, so to speak. One more here. Anyone else want to jump in? All right, let's roll. Yes.
Is there any conceptualization of a Ferrerian homeschooling movement, or would that reinforce the nuclear family?
He, to my knowledge, didn't write any specific critiques of the nuclear family as such, but he had no trust in the average family in Barcelona to properly educate their family, their child rather. He felt like most of society was steeped in what he would call essentially backwards religious political doctrines, and so he thought that basically specialists who were trained in the latest science and rational thought should be training students. So he was very critical. I mean, I don't think homeschooling was really a thing then, but had it been, I don't think he would have liked it. Yeah, and up here, yeah.
You mentioned Freemasonry a couple times.
Yeah.
I know Freemasonry and Republicanism at the time were associated. I was just hoping you could expand on that. Is there any
This is my first Mason question at these presentations. I'm so happy. Expand on Freemasonry?
Yeah.
So, without going into unnecessary detail, Freemasonry was a big part of international revolutionary circles at the turn of the 20th century, especially after the requirement that Freemasons believe in God was stricken from several different national Masonic societies. You get all sorts of different socialists and Republicans and anarchists and radicals and quote-unquote freethinkers involved, including in the case of France, some really important politicians. So there's some trials during this era where there's reason to believe that essentially back-channel Masonic connections were responsible for some of these would-be assassins being acquitted in these trials. Ferrer ascends to, I think, the second highest rank in Masonry, and there's like 32 or 33 ranks. So he gets really high, and in that sense, in these kind of circles, he's a huge deal, which is partly why this protest movement becomes so fierce. Essentially, what kind of united a lot of these Masons was a rejection of clericalism, a belief in rationalism, a sort of continued nostalgia for the basic kind of principles of the French Revolution. And that's what's interesting is that they were kinds of, we look back on this stuff and we see anarchists, we see socialists. There were these interesting spaces, and to some extent that's true today too, right? Where people of different tendencies work on projects together, collaborate, even when you think they might hate each other or actually friends, actually support each other, debate things. And Masonry was big in this era, and he was a big Mason, and that was one of the accusations thrown at him by conservative critics, was that you're part of this shadowy Masonic conspiracy, and sometimes there were Masonic conspiracies. Masons conspired sometimes. He was one of them. Mason questions made my evening. All right, so if there's, yeah, I see one more, and then this is actually the last shot if you want to get in a question. Okay, last question of the night. Yes. So political repercussions, like in Spain, or
in Spain or in other places as well.
Sure.
Like hypothesize that other countries would be less likely to execute school teachers, or I don't know.
Good question. Why execute him if he was completely innocent? Part of it was essentially they felt like he had gotten away with one in 1906 for his role in the conspiracy to kill the king, and I think he probably did. So they were looking for a way, they being state officials, looking for a way to get him for a while. What happened with the Tragic Week was a primarily anti-clerical rebellion. So even though the Anarchist Labor Federation was big in calling the general strike, there were no efforts to occupy workplaces or to seize armaments, to organize a revolution. It was very much channeled in anti-clerical direction, largely because of the role of radical Republicans in it. So essentially they figured they owed him one. the Spanish state during this era was not too concerned about public opinion. It was more concerned by this point than it had been decades earlier, but not concerned enough to really be too concerned about some selective judicial irregularities. The protest movement, when Ferrer was executed, was actually not especially big in Spain, largely because with this tragic week rebellion, there was a lot of repression, radical circles were in disarray, other people were in and out of prison. Also because the anarchists in Spain were sort of suspicious of him as being a little too much of a Republican, the Republicans suspicious of him being a little too much of an anarchist. Working class circles appreciated his money for the unions, but they saw him as sort of a bourgeois guy. You know, he fell through all the normal cracks of this kind of stuff. And then repercussions for his execution. The prime minister at the time, Antonio Maura, was essentially sort of forced to step down because of the backlash against this, but there were other factors there as well. You can see the protest movement around Ferrer and other protest movements in support of tortured and executed anarchists and radicals as kind of a predecessor to Sacco and Vanzetti and other similar kinds of campaigns. I don't know of a lot of school teachers being executed prior to fascism and Nazism. But in terms of the larger question of did it make, for example, the Spanish state less likely to be brutal, maybe a little bit here and there. Some of these, I mean, there is evidence that Spanish state officials during this era were concerned about international condemnation. They were, and they wanted to avoid it. But still, you get this kind of escalating class war that only grows over the next decade and gets so, quote-unquote, intense out of hand that the Primo de Rivera dictatorship starts in 1923. The government says we can't handle this liberal democracy, or it wasn't really democratic even by parliamentary standards, but it becomes more repressive. So I do think you can situate the Ferrer campaign within this kind of growing polarization in Spanish society that leads up to the Spanish Civil War. Yes. Okay, so I think that's all for now. Thank you, Blue Stockings, and thank you for filming, Sonny. Sonny did not pan the audience, if you're concerned about that. I was supposed to say something in the beginning and forgot that. And the books are up there. It's got all sorts of historical documents that have never been translated into English before, so check it out. Thanks.